Craig Dumont with Dominion Leadership Network, and with me today is Dr. Terry Cross, the Dean of Religion at Lee University, and it is just a great privilege that I have of having the opportunity to talk with Dr. Cross on a regular basis and record these. And Dr. Cross, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This morning I wanted to talk a little bit, and you and I, when we discussed our next topic, when I had mentioned something about atonement, I mean, you were on the phone, but it seemed like you almost lit up because that was an important topic to you.
Right.
And it seems like it's something that is, I kind of thought the doctrine and teaching atonement was kind of set in stone, so to speak. And yet it's not. There's a lot of, I hate to use the word attacks, but
no, I think that's a fair word.
Yeah, or challenges to it. Would you share a little bit of your thoughts on this?
Sure. Atonement is one of those very interesting doctrines that never had one particular model that had the stamp of approval by the whole church. So there are basic theories and models of how the atonement has worked its benefit for us through Christ's life and death and resurrection. So some of them emphasize that Christ is a sacrifice who atones for our sins, and there's the imagery from the Old Testament Levitical sacrifice to the New, and some of them have images of Christ as a victor over death, hell, and the grave, and the devil. So it was more of an emphasis on the resurrection, and the atoning power of Christ is that power to live the Christian life. Then there are some other views and theories, one of which was that God was punishing humans, and Christ took the place for us so that the wrath of God became wrath on him. And there are scriptures that will also support that, clearly. With some of these atonement theories, in about the last 20 years, there's been a beginning turn with several groups to relook at the question of the cross and violence. So it's a question that comes from several groups, one of which is a sociological read as to why we're focusing as a group or a people on this kind of scapegoat of receiving the punishment from God and sin. And they offer some ways around that, they think. A second group are pacifists or the Anabaptists in particular. And they have argued that there are other emphases that we could have instead of the emphasis that appears to be on violence in the cross. And a third group are some feminist theologians who really attack the idea that this is divine child abuse in their phrase.
Yeah, I've read a lot of
You
it.
have read this?
Yeah, I read, yes.
Well, that's the part that I think caused me to start sitting up a little bit and paying attention. Because this is the discussion, the hottest topic in theology in 2015 and probably the last 10 years has been the atonement. And it's because of these issues. Here's how it plays out and why I think it's an important thing for everyone to know that's happening in the theological world. The question is this, that is put forward by these individuals together, I suppose. If the cross, an act of violence, to be sure, if the cross is the centerpiece of our Christian life and theology, does that tend to make us, as human beings who are Christians, more violent in our behavior? Okay, I have read, but I just cannot quite understand the basis underneath that, frankly. And I think I figured out why something is not just quite right.
Makes you kind of want to kill him, doesn't it?
No, the part I'm missing, I mean, I don't want to promote violent behavior. Really, I don't. Yes. And so there's a sense in which I'm agreeing with several of these that, yeah, okay, I might not go as far as the pacifist, and I might not go as far as some of the others in terms of what they perceive as violence. But I think on the cross there's something else going on.
Mm-hmm.
So that what occurs on there are several problems. First of all, the problem has been we have emphasized the cross to the exclusion of the resurrection and to the exclusion of the life of Christ. So I think the incarnation, life of Christ, the death of Christ, and the resurrection is a whole package that provides for us our salvation, which is what we could call the whole package for atonement. I do think there can be a tendency to fixate on the suffering Christ to such a degree that we leave him on the cross and don't move on to the resurrection, which I think is a delicate balance that must be held by all of us who are calling ourselves Christians. If I overemphasize the cross, I overemphasize and glorify suffering. If I overemphasize the resurrection, on the other hand, and forget the cross, I will glorify triumphalism, things that are mine and winning and power. I think what then the first thing is to try to repair that. Yeah.
I know that in the past we talked some about the ascension of Christ as well.
Yeah. That for me, the resurrection and ascension belong together.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
Even though time-wise they're a little
right.
separate.
I was just going to ask you: is it because perhaps, like for instance, Paul, when I read him, even when he mentions the cross, okay, and only the cross,
right.
It seems to me like that he isn't just referring to just the cross. He's more like what you were talking about. He's talking about kind of the whole continuum, I guess, or the whole death, burial, resurrection, ascension type of a scenario. He wasn't trying to divide anything out particularly.
I would say that the first century church, when it speaks of the cross, and Paul in particular, you almost have to put a hyphen word, cross hyphen resurrection.
Yeah.
So I teach my classes, the best way to remember this is to think, whenever you say the cross, think of the cross resurrection event. Mm-hmm. That's a more broadening way to help focus, a healthy focus on both sides of this. Mm-hmm. There are some ways we can talk about how if you fixate only on the wounds of Jesus or the passion of the Christ, there are forms of piety that come out of that where you will mutilate yourself and beat yourself up. There are some of those still out there today. This was true, however, more so historically in the Middle Ages, for example.
You know, I think that may be, and I may be on my own on this. I'm not going to describe any of these feelings towards you or these thoughts to you, but it seems like this need for atonement, if we don't have an understanding or if we don't accept the atonement of Christ, or however we may want to come to accept that teaching about God, us being at one with God through Christ, that we will look for other ways to atone. We're going to be a guilty people, always feeling like we that we aren't worthy to we talked earlier about walking as a Christian, living as a Christian. If we have that guilt that's there, we're really a beaten people. I think that we have a lot of guilt manipulation in our society today that really comes down to this: the world doesn't understand atonement, and so they feel guilty about everything. And because we haven't perhaps talked as much about atonement or stressed what God accomplished for us on the cross and how it applies to our life, that we're too often feeling guilty.
This raises a wonderful biblical concept called reconciliation. So in 2 Corinthians 5, this is probably, atonement is an Old English word. The first times it is used is in the middle of the 1500s. And it's the idea of being at one meant. So they made a noun out of this description of putting two words together, at one meant. So it's an odd formation for an English word. We've spiritualized it, so it kind of just means something like forgiveness or results that lead to forgiveness and relationship with God. But there's, I think, a deeper meaning here. In the New Testament, the atoning idea has the idea of also reconciling, so that the enmity that was once between God and us has been removed, and there is at-one-ment. And so this is the message of reconciliation that we've been given to share with the world. The good news is that God, through Christ, is no longer at odds with us, and we don't need to be at odds with Him. And I think that's the message that is simple, and yet the world is longing for that, because they recognize there's something wrong, some guilt that hangs over them that they don't quite know what it's for or where it's from.
Terry, where do you mentioned a few different views of atonement, and perhaps some groups their problems with it. What do they want? What are they trying to replace it with?
Yeah, that's a really fine question. Let's take the scapegoat idea. Okay, that the sense of the best of the representatives who are speaking about this. One of them is an American Baptist named Mark Heim, Heim, and he suggests that the violence that occurs on the cross was to show all of us that God is putting an end to violence, so that we don't need to be violent people, because the last sacrifice, the last scapegoat, has been offered up in Jesus Christ. So it's I would say that's a way of looking at the sacrifice of Christ in a new perspective. And I've actually benefited from this kind of insight from Mark. I think there are other things going on in the atonement than just the scapegoat idea. But that comes from Leviticus 16, where one of the goats is killed, and one of the goats has the sins of the people laid on him, and he goes out into the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I don't mean to jump in here too much. That reminded me, I'm not sure who it was. It seemed like it was a French philosopher who had come up with, I'm coming out of memory, it may be wrong, but they were influenced by a French philosopher who said he had surveyed history and studied it, and that every society came up with a scapegoat mechanism. But in their case, it was always they were innocent and they made one person guilty. And then he started to use the scapegoat idea. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, well, wait a second, that's not a new discovery. First of all, the scapegoat, even the language comes from the Bible.
Right.
And it wasn't an innocent people, or it wasn't people trying to prove their innocence by scapegoating one. It was the people acknowledging their guilt by transferring it. So it's an interesting way that they've come up.
Yeah, the name of that French, he's a literary critic and also a quasi-philosopher, is René Girard, Girard.
Okay.
And I think he's still alive. He taught at Stanford for many years, although he's a native from France. He started this theory not in connection to religion. So he made a statement and an assessment that all groups throughout the world have a history of violence that kind of caps at a certain point, and it is released something like a pressure valve by blaming one person or one group of people. The best example I can give from his description is the Nazis blaming the Jews for the problems at the beginning of the 1930s, so that what was the problem of why we were having inflation? International Jewry was the response of Hitler. So that's a people, in order to alleviate tendencies toward violence, to focus their violence in a more legitimate way than just killing each other. And he thinks nowadays that the law courts are taking the place of this kind of violent relief, but he suggests that this is a very primitive urge. Okay, that's a sociological, anthropological read of ancient peoples and of modern peoples. I think it still has some debatable value, but it's a theory. What he does then later is apply that to the people of Israel and the religious theme. So that's when, really in the 1980s, when this began to be brought up through his theories and come to the religious world, that's when the discussion started to spark. Because it joined with an interest of other theologians who wanted to make the center of the faith less violent. And that was their perception, that this was too violent. So they're not wanting to replace salvation or atonement per se with some other system of salvation. They just are not fond of the violence that is there. So they want to blame the violence on, for example, the powers of evil, and not in God's plan or in God's intention.
You know, it's interesting because just giving, as I'm thinking about this, no matter what they do, though, they can't get away from, the cross was violent, whether it was God, whether it was evil.
Yes.
I mean, you know, their desire to move away from violence, I guess I can understand them wanting to come up with a way to transfer it away from blaming God, or for having God responsible for it, might be a better way to say that.
That's a really important theological point. I don't want to take God out of
No,
that
I don't
equation.
either, but I think they do.
Well, absolutely, because another group suggests after René Girard that this is a divine cosmic child abuse. So the Father God punishes the Son. That model and motif for atonement, they suggest, is helping abusive parents everywhere to support the theory that they can abuse their children. Let's just cut to the quick here. I think what they've done is applied what they see happening on the cross with their own understanding of what happens in human nature, and then have read that upward to God. I've got a directional going here. Instead of reading what God did through the cross and that giving us information about God and about how we should live with each other, they're reading how they live violently back upward into God. So I think there's a projection here from their own experience of life upward. That does not deny the fact that they have a legitimate complaint about too much abuse that goes on and too much violence. But my response to that as a Christian is they have misunderstood two things. Number one, they've misunderstood the Trinity. And number two, they've misunderstood the incredible love of God, which is why I don't want to pull God out of the equation. I want God to be doing this. Now, what's the this that he's doing? They have not understood the Trinity in that their claim is that God the Father is punishing the Son for our benefit. Therefore, he is abusing his own child. The Trinity is missed in that. We have only God the Father who is doing something to the Son. A Trinitarian understanding is going to say the Father would not and cannot do something to the Son that the Son is not willing and wanting to do. So there was complete agreement in the will, a union of will between Father and Son in order for this event to occur. The Son did not go kicking and screaming to the death of the cross. He confronted it with fear as a human being, but he submitted. And he did that because he, as he says out of his own mouth, no one takes my life, I give it up voluntarily. That isn't just the human Jesus is saying that. I believe that's the divine Son of God saying that. So if we have God in the flesh, we can't, and that we are understanding the Trinity is rich enough, we can't remove that one member of the Trinity and say he's doing something onto the other member of the Trinity without that person's approval, permission, or willingness. So that, to me, removes the issue of child abuse.
You know, that's interesting. So I hadn't thought about that. So really, there's, without meaning to do so, because we don't want to ascribe that, but without meaning to do that, there's actually an undermining of Trinitarian thought if we pursue some. I hadn't thought about that. That's
very
interesting.
strong,
Yeah.
I think. And I think a projection of who that God must be through our own lens and experience of violence, rather than allowing the revelation that God brings to us to reveal that. The second thing is the concept of love that I think is misunderstood. This concept of love is also balanced with justice. So this is not an ooey-gooey love that allows anything to continue. There is some kind of penalty that is attached to sin, and God has made the remedy for that. That's, I think, the simple statement of atonement. What it cost the Son of God was his life. It also cost the Trinity dearly, because one of its own was, in some sense, affected by and ripped apart by death. And there's something like an experience of death in God's own being, as Jürgen Moltmann will say. What that means, we maybe don't know, but if only the human Jesus experiences something of the death, then you've made Jesus Christ into a schizophrenic. You've got to have something happening on the cross that also affects the nature of God. And that's a really critical point, theologically speaking, and trinitarianly speaking. So the love of God is reaching to such an extent that it costs God everything, that it's known in terms of peace and harmony within its own being. There is a third thing here, and I think it's a really important thing to point out. The act on the cross is violent, but it's brought there to that level of violence because of sin. So I think anybody who uses the cross as justification for their own violence is really finding some kind of rationalization of their own sin. So they just want to say something like that. I don't think it sets us up to be sinners like that. If anything, it sets us up to turn the cheek. And that's because of what has been remedied in our hearts from the sin. The Bible also doesn't say that this, it doesn't use the word violence to describe this. It will use the word wrath of God, which is a biblical term. One of the other theories has suggested that God is angry and needs to pour out his wrath on Christ and anger on Christ. I don't think God is angry at us. He's angry at the fact that sin has occurred. His wrath in the scriptures is a punishment term. It's not an emotion-filled term. And that needs to be, I think, clarified so that we don't have a violent God reacting out of some emotion on Jesus Christ or on us. The punishment is meted in love as much as the good things that come to us.
Well, the judicial aspect, not so much the emotional aspect, but the judicial aspect is actually at the foundation of what we would call Western Christian thought. But I'm just curious, and maybe we'll kind of wrap this up and do a second section here so we don't keep drawing this out a little bit too far. But with the emphasis, I'm just, as we were talking about the anger, but the Bible does say that God is angry with the wicked every day, and that's old and new. And I know what you're talking about, but it's not that. But at the same time that he's angry with the wicked, he also makes a just way to save them. I don't know how to get around just saying, hey, listen, this is a mystery, it's salvation. There's a salvation issue here. And so I don't know if it's simply that his emotion is, I'm angry, so I'm going to get you, as much as you had mentioned that he's angry with sin. I think that, I don't know if when I think about it, I don't think that there's a disconnect between the individual. I don't. I'm not saying, because I think that too often we kind of try to make some things spiritual, but I think man's kind of a unified whole. So I think God is angry with the wicked every day, but I think that his righteousness, the Bible says you can be angry and sin not, so I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, this is really, I think, a very good exercise to think through. When God is angry, do we mean by that exactly the same thing we mean when we say we are angry?
Yeah.
And what would a perfect being look like with that as one of the features? And what makes God angry? These are really very important and big questions, I think, to dig at more.
We'll come back in just a minute.
Okay.